Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for those of you who are with us in person. For those of you catching it on the rerun, thank you for checking in for this informational session. On behalf of the Reverend Dr. Jesse Boyd Bottoms, who is the pastor of the Beulah Baptist Church hosting for this evening, it's my privilege and honor to welcome you to our informational session on fair housing. We have a phenomenal cast of people who are experts in their fields who will hopefully answer questions and assuage concerns that we, the community, have. So as we get together and get forward, it is the principle of the house that we just open in a prayer. So if you'd be so kind to bow with me for just a moment. All-wise God, thank you for information, for those who have the compassion to do the work, to educate, to uplift, and to empower, and we will push forward. Amen. So as we are here, we want to be respectful of the house. Please make note of the exits in case of emergency. Do not go out that one, because that one leads to a locked gate. There are exits in the rear, exits to the side, one more behind us. And I do believe that is all I signed up to do on this particular evening. So at this point in time, we'll invite the Mayor Flowers, City of Poughkeepsie, for a few welcoming remarks.
Well, welcome, everyone. I want to thank Jody Miller for the Dutchess County Commission on Human Rights for hosting this and everyone else that's involved. And to have, I'm sorry, I'm like right in front of you. And also to have individuals here that are expertise in the fair housing. I mean, right now, we are going through a transformation of we're trying to expand housing in the city of Poughkeepsie. And also there's other elements that are happening that from past practices have determined how our neighborhoods were actually created. And so we need to look at and make sure that we're not going to continue on that path of making those same mistakes. We also have, it's been coming up now, we know we have the shelter that's about to come into our neighborhood. It keeps coming up about how that's affected with the Fair Housing Act. So myself, I don't know about anyone else, but I also wanted to know, some things of how that even interacts with certain things or services that are put in certain neighborhoods that might be a hindrance to the growth of that neighborhood, which many of us, like I said, has been brought up that it also, it goes against the fair housing. So this is something that I'm looking forward to hearing, what each of you has had to say about this whole topic. And also, again, so that as we're moving forward, everyone has the equal opportunity to, to receive the housing that they deserve, whether if it's home ownership or just in rentals. For me, this is a big thing that I'm here to learn about. So I appreciate you having this forum, and be able to provide this opportunity so we can have these conversations in regards to this, so we know how we move forward in creating these vibrant neighborhoods in our city of Poughkeepsie. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Flowers. I'm Jody Miller. I'm with the Commission on Human Rights. I want to welcome you all here today. We are really, and want to thank Reverend Bottoms, Mrs. Bottoms, Reverend McPhee, and the Beulah community for hosting us here today. It was suggested to me to make this request to host this program here, that this is a really wonderful location for people to come to. I've been here for many other events and have loved it. So I really want to thank you for hosting us today. I also want to thank our sign language interpreters, Emily and Diane from ASLI. They've been provided by the New York State Division of Human Rights, through the New York State Division of Human Rights. I really want to appreciate, thank you for that, John. And looking forward to our amazing panel today. I also want to shout out our commission member, Christina Aquino, who's, I think, still at the front door, and our former Commission on Human Rights member, Jen Drake. So thank you for being here tonight. So the purpose of tonight's event is to give some basic information and overview about what is fair housing, both on the federal and state level. What exactly is it? What does it mean? What are the trends? And what are some resources if you think you've experienced a fair housing issue? Where can you go for help? So that's how we laid this out, to just really kind of be very basic and clear and then lots of time for questions, because we anticipate you will have questions. What we know is that we need an abundance of housing here in Dutchess County and across the country, right? This is not unique to Dutchess County, but the people that are being affected is significant. With rents rising, with the limited housing stock that's available, limited apartments, we need more housing. So that's not rocket science. I mean, everybody recognizes that, and how do we get it? So one of the things that I think is that we need like really kind of fair housing of the heart. We need people who are making decisions about zoning and planning to think outside the box a little bit in terms of the many different ways that housing can look, including accessory dwelling units. It could be a tiny home. It could be an apartment in a house. It could look a lot of different ways that isn't just about building new housing. We need that too. And we have to look at all of the ways that we can increase the amount of housing that is available for everyone who needs it. So, and we have the expertise and the resources in terms of housing expertise right here with Hudson River Housing, Ulster County RUPCO, and they're now going to be doing some work over here, and other housing experts who know how to get this done. We need the will. So we'll start tonight with what is fair housing, what are the trends, so that you have more information to be empowered in terms of your own decision making and your own conversations that you have with people who are making decisions about housing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first guest, and I'm going to ask our guests to just introduce yourselves, since I don't have formal introductions for each of them, and we're also going to have some snacks after. Okay, here you go.
So you had to lay that snacks part in right before I get to go. Good evening, everybody. My name is John Harry, and I'm with the New York State Division of Human Rights. Our agency enforces the New York State human rights law, and that law includes protections for people in a variety of protected classes. So race, religion, creed, national origin, source of income, and disability, which is, I'm supposed to be speaking about trending areas in fair housing. Those are the two big ones. Disability makes up over half of the housing complaints that we get. So allegations of discrimination in housing, more than half of the complaints that we get at our agency include allegations of discrimination based on disability. And source of income is the one that's catching up with disability. And this past month, we've done a lot of fair housing programming around the state. April is Fair Housing Month. I want to say thank you to the Dutchess County Commission on Human Rights for having me here today, and to the church for giving us this facility. It's very nice to be here. So I'm glad that we have two people here that are going to talk about those two areas, because those indeed are the ones that we're seeing at our agency in terms of trending. So with Fair Housing Month, we've gotten around the state, and I'm happy to report we've actually had more programs where we've had the covered entity in the room. So while it's always great to talk about people in the people in the community, people who advocate on their behalf, whether they're attorneys or advocates, or people who are just facing fair housing issues or crises every day. I love to be in a room with people who are facing and living these challenges, so that I can go back to my agency and ensure that we are providing enforcement in a way that meets those needs and those concerns, and in many ways that crises. In ways that are effective. But I liked having the covered entities in the room. When I say covered entities, I mean realtors, I mean developers, I mean builders, I mean the people that are on the other side of the coin in terms of providing the housing or providing access to the housing. Having them in the room rather than having them in front of the judge, okay, which is sometimes where we end up, has a lot more value. Because if we get to talk to the realtors, if we get to talk to the attorneys who represent the builders, if we get to talk to the builders and let them know these are your obligations under the Fair Housing Law, to provide equal access to housing, not to discriminate, not to deny housing opportunities because of the color of someone's skin, or because they have a disability, or because of their source of income. And that if you do so, there are avenues of enforcement. There are penalties that are significant. Realtors can lose their license for engaging in fair housing discrimination in the state of New York. We have a partnership with the New York State Department of State. When I was in front of the room full of realtors, I wasn't hammering this quite so much, but I wanted to make sure they knew that if they engaged in discrimination in their practices as realtors, right, the gateway, the first person you're going to speak with most times when you're looking to rent or purchase a home, or you're going to sell or what have you, is a realtor, right? Somebody's going to help me find an apartment. Somebody's going to help me find a home. If that realtor is engaged right from the start, stereotyping, stigmatizing, making judgments because of the color of your skin, or because you say I have a voucher, or because you say I live with a child, I have a child who's living with autism, and from go, your opportunities to find housing are diminished by that realtor. We're talking about a real terrible impact on the ability to enforce fair housing in the state of New York. So I'm happy to report that this past month we have met with members of the Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors, which numbers in the 15,000, okay, membership-wise. I've done programming with the New York State Association of Realtors. We did a program with the Real Estate Board of New York last week in Manhattan. And again, these were great opportunities to get into the room with the realtors, to talk about how we enforce the law, to talk about some of the penalties that are involved if they violate fair housing laws. And as I say, we have this relationship with Department of State. So Department of State licensed realtors here in New York, okay? Under the New York State Human Rights Law, if a realtor denies housing or treats you differently or in a worse way because of the color of your skin or your religion or your sexual orientation or your gender identity, we have a variety of protected classes under the New York State Human Rights Law, okay? They engage in that. Yeah, we can hit them with fines and penalties. We can order them to take training so that they never do it again. And there are some real penalties there. New York State Department of State can pull their license, okay? Now, New York State Department of State can't issue the fines and penalties that we can, so it ends up being a good partnership in terms of being committed to enforcement in this area. On the other side of comply or else, okay, is what I heard, which really resonated with me when I was up in Albany for the New York Association on Realtors program, which was a statewide program. And they started the program by recognizing realtors federally, like across the country. They were going to be recognized for their work in fair housing. And we were in a big room like this one, and they had screens up, and they were having these realtors come in from all over the country, you know, about half dozen or so, that were being recognized nationally for their fair housing work. And the theme that came across when these realtors presented to the other real estate agents that were in the room is, my bottom line got better. I had more customers, I had more clients, I made more money. Why? Because I broadened my customer base. I didn't make it exclusive, I made it inclusive. I didn't make it exclusive, I made it inclusive. Okay? I wanted to broaden the types of persons that I was sharing housing opportunities with. And you know what that resulted in? Yeah, more money in my pocket, which was really nice, but also resulted in community building. Community building is about having diverse and inclusive communities. And these realtors were realizing that, and they were sharing it with other realtors who were in the room. And I thought, I am so happy that I'm getting to get to speak next, because the tone has been set. I don't have to stand in front of the room and say, comply or else you're going to lose your license, you're going to get hit with civil fines and penalties. That's one way to try to sell the message, right? Becomes a finger-pointing exercise. But when you have the opportunity to hear in your industry that you can set this standard, that you can build fair housing into your business and see these results, not only improving your bottom line, but also be engaged in positive community building, that's a win-win. And I really, so I really like to share that experience that I had, to say that there are ways to look at enforcement, which clearly always, needs more in the way of resources and time and effort. I can appreciate that, given that I work for the agency that enforces the state human rights law. But I think there's also a lot of value in working with the covered entities, the realtors, the builders, the landlords, et cetera, so that they can understand it's not just a civil fine or a penalty. It's about community building. It's about inclusivity in the way that you operate. There was a story, I just shared it with the folks here. You may have come across it, but out in Hampton Bays, New York, they have laborers who build these big, multi-million-dollar mansions. They live in the woods. The laborers live in the woods, are cooking their food over campfires because there's no affordable housing in Hampton Bays for them to live in. It's criminal. That is criminal. So there is a lot of work to do. I'm really glad to be here this evening with my other panelists. And just to wrap it up, I just want to talk a little bit about how our agency enforces the law. So a lot of times I can talk about sophisticated pieces of law and what have you, and invariably somebody raises their hand and says, how do I file a complaint, And I have to make sure that we get to some of that information so that people know what to do if they've experienced discrimination. So the New York State Division of Human Rights is considered a little more of a user-friendly alternative to the court system, okay? You can go into state court, file a New York State human rights law claim, but you really should have a lawyer. They're going to charge you a fee. There's a lot of paperwork, okay? Alternatively, you can come to the New York State Division of Human Rights. You can download the form online. We will accommodate people who have disabilities that might need an alternative format or maybe need to come into the office to meet with somebody one-on-one to do the complaint intake. We have the complaints available in any language that's being requested. We also have them available in Braille. Every now and then I'll get a request for a Braille complaint, and we can provide that as well. So what happens? So the complaint is, it's a narrative really with kind of just tell us what happened. A lot of times people will say, how do I prove it? Right? I missed out on this job, on this housing opportunity. I don't know if it was because of the color of my skin or because I said I had a voucher or because I was in a wheelchair, right? How am I going to prove that? It's not your job to prove it, okay? We have investigators who are responsible for investigating and gathering information, and they have a lot of latitude and power and authority to do that. And I love when I talk to our housing director, because she says, when we don't get to an answer, we can't quite get, what is the answer? Why did that person not get that housing opportunity that they were otherwise qualified for? We know the answer, okay? So once that complaint gets filed, it gets assigned to an investigator. Investigator's gonna gather information, collect as much in the way of facts, interview witnesses, whatever. And people like to say, I have boxes and boxes of evidence that I want to share with you, and that's wonderful. Save it until the investigator gets assigned, okay? And once the investigator gets assigned, they're going to ask you for what the relevant information is pertaining to your case, okay? We will serve that. A lot of times I get asked, can I file this complaint anonymously? Okay, and the answer is no, okay? So, and I'm going to get to a couple things on that, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues here. We have a division-initiated investigations unit, okay, that's dedicated to pattern and practice type housing discrimination. So as you folks are here in the room tonight and you see a new residential, multifamily unit being put up, and there are steps into all the ground floor units, it's a violation of the Fair Housing Act in the New York State Human Rights Law. Those ground floor units need to be accessible for people who use wheelchairs if it's new residential construction with 3 or more units, okay? So I get to deputize everybody tonight, okay, to see these things and to share them with us because we have a unit that's dedicated to this pattern and practice type discrimination. Let me get back to the anonymous complaint, okay? I don't want to file this complaint. I'm afraid things are already bad, right? Maybe you have the housing, maybe you're living there, and your landlord has turned off the heat and the hot water or is threatening to evict you, right? And all you're trying to do is to get the same services that everybody else in the building is getting. Okay, I mentioned the authority our investigators have. They can actually speak. They call it comparative data. They will speak, or at least ask to speak, to other residents and tenants that are in the building, okay? And they'll ask, how's your heat and hot water been? How have your requests for repairs been responded to? And sometimes people will say, I haven't had heat or hot water either. This landlord doesn't discriminate. He's terrible to everybody in the building, okay? That might be a different agency that we share that information with, okay? But other times we'll find that, it's the family that's living with the child who's living with schizophrenia, who's being denied the heat and the hot water, okay? Who's being threatened with eviction. Or it's the family that's living with somebody of a certain sexual orientation or a certain gender identity, okay? And that family is being targeted by a bad actor, a bad landlord, by refusing to provide heat and hot water, hoping they'll go on their own. Okay, we can get to the bottom of that. and investigate and prosecute that, okay? The other thing I want to share is there are protections against retaliation. So if you file that complaint, I don't want to serve this complaint, it's on my landlord, I understand all that, but that behavior is going to continue. If you leave, somebody else comes in, the behavior is going to continue. It's like a free pass, okay? And in all likelihood, if there's discrimination going on, we can fix the problem. We can even get you compensated monetarily for the discrimination you endured while you're there, okay? The other part of that is you are protected against retaliation. So if the landlord gets this complaint and says, that's it, I'm evicting this one, okay, get served with eviction papers, even if the underlying claim falls apart, maybe we find out, you know what, it wasn't really discrimination. You went through a rough stretch there, but it really didn't have anything to do with discrimination. That retaliation that took place after the complaint was filed, that threatened to evict that took place, that's unlawful retaliation, and we can put the landlord on the hook for that. So again, I like to emphasize that so that people aren't afraid to come to the agency to file a complaint. We also have immigration status protections. It's the human rights law. Not the American rights law, not the U.S. citizen rights law, human rights law. We do not get involved in what somebody's citizenship status is here in New York. Okay, we cover people here in the state of New York under the human rights law. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I think we're saving them until the end, yes?
And thank you, John. And so just to let everybody know, we do have a handout with all of the agencies, all of the speakers, their agencies, and how to reach their agencies. There's a handout on the front table. So if you want to follow up with any of these agencies, their agencies that will be the speakers tonight, you can do so. So with that, I'll turn it over to Justin.
Okay, I have a slide presentation. I don't know if put that up. Yep, that was it. So hi everybody, my name is Justin Haynes and I'm an attorney. I work for the New York State Office of the Attorney General, Letitia James, and I'm an Assistant Attorney General in the Poughkeepsie Regional Office. So just so you know, we have major offices in New York City and Albany, but throughout the state we have various regional offices where you can get in contact with us. And just a little bit about, I'm going to speak about source of income discrimination, which is relatively new. But first I want to tell you a little bit about the Attorney General's office. At the Attorney General's office, we're the people's lawyer. We're, you can, slides are, yeah, you can go ahead, another slide. So we're the people's lawyer, and the Attorney General serves as the guardian of the legal rights of the citizens of New York. And the Attorney General can file lawsuits on behalf of the people of the state of New York against landlords for repeated and persistent violations of law. Okay, next slide. Okay. You can keep going. All right, well, maybe I'll just move ahead. Okay, so what is source of income discrimination? So we were talking about the human rights law of New York State, and it covers many things that you might be familiar with, things like race, gender, sexual orientation, national origin, familial status, like as a parent. It can, I believe, service member, military status. There's a lot of statuses, different characteristics of people. In 2019, in April 2019, they added source of lawful income as a protected status. And this law, it protects people makes it unlawful to refuse to sell, rent, or lease, or otherwise deny, or withhold from any person or group of persons such housing accommodations because of, and here this is because of their race, and gender and things like that. Now you can say, and because of their lawful source of income. Or, which is actually in the case of source of income discrimination much more common, to represent that the housing's not available for inspection, sale, rental, or lease, when in fact it is available. It's also unlawful to print or circulate any statement, advertisement, or publication, or use any form of application for the purchase, rental, or lease of housing, which expressly directs or indirectly any limitation, specification, or discrimination as to the protected status or any intent to make such limitation, specification, or discrimination. That's a lot of legal words that says you can't put on your rental application, I don't take a certain type of income. And so what are those types of income that we're talking about? We're talking about things like federal, state, or local housing assistance, including housing choice vouchers or the Section 8 program. It can be a DSS program for public assistance, or DCFS here in Dutchess County. It could be that they don't want to count your income because it is Social Security benefits. It could be that they don't want to count your income because it's child support or alimony or spousal support, or because some of your income comes from foster care subsidies. Everyone's sort of more familiar with employment income, but there's a lot of different forms of income, including how you pay your rent through a program. And this law can apply even, I've seen, this situation come up where suddenly you've been on the waiting list for Section 8 for 10 years, and now you're living somewhere and you come up on the list and you have a Section 8 voucher to use. It's also when they refuse to allow you to use it in a place you're already living. And so how does this discrimination kind of manifest? The most clear way is like direct discrimination, where the landlord just says, I don't take vouchers or programs. And this is not uncommon. Before I was with the Attorney General's office, I worked in legal services for 17 years, and up here in Poughkeepsie for 5 years. And I had plenty of clients who were told, I'll take Section 8, but I won't take anything from DCFS. Or I'll take Pathstone Section 8, but I won't, or I'll take Pathstone Section 8, but I won't take the City of Poughkeepsie Section 8. That is all covered by this law. That is illegal behavior, saying that you're not going to take someone's rental voucher. But like I was alluding to earlier, the most common way that people experience this discrimination is you might call up and say, I'd like to look at this apartment. You go look at the apartment. While you're looking at the apartment, you say, I have Section 8. And then they don't give you the rental application to apply for that apartment. Or you apply for the apartment and then you get ghosted. You never hear again from them. And you still see it advertised online, things like that. Or whenever they kind of put you in a different situation than otherwise, for example, stating that there's a wait list, but it's only for people with Section 8. Or I've heard people, this was popular in the Bronx when I worked in the Bronx, that they would only take working Section 8, meaning that you have Section 8 and your other source of income is employment income, not a government benefit program like DSS. Or if they say that because you have Section 8, you can rent the apartment, but you need to have a guarantor, or you need to pay 5 months of rent up front. Those are all things that are treating you different because of the type of income that you plan to pay your rent with. One of the areas of the law that's a little less clear, in some ways is still being litigated in courts, is things that are having a policy that might look like it's neutral as it applies to everybody, but when you get down to it and you apply it to someone with a Section 8, it totally doesn't make sense, and it's going to act to always prevent them from getting the housing. And so an example is you must make 40 times the monthly rent in income. That's a way of discriminating against you without saying they're discriminating against you, because it shouldn't matter. If you have a voucher program of some kind that's going to pay your whole rent, it doesn't matter what your income is otherwise, because that program is going to pay that rent. So those are like sort of what we call pretext, that they make it seem like they're not discriminating, but they actually are discriminating against you. There are still legal ways that landlords try and get around this law and getting around discriminating against tenants, unfortunately. And that's because some things, they try and find the loopholes, right? So in this area, one example could be that they raise the rent above what they know the top rent for the program is going to be. We call that the payment standard. And believe me, I've talked to the Section 8 administrators in the area, and they have said, is this legal? I mean, that they can raise the rent, 20% just to get out of having a Section 8 tenant? And, until some new laws are coming into effect, that might be legal, that they're raising rents above the payment standards. So they're not gonna say it's to not have Section 8 tenants, but that is the effect of having that rent so high that the programs can't pay for it. Landlords are still allowed to look at, they're not supposed to consider your prior involvement in housing court. If you ever faced eviction in the past, they're not supposed to ask about it on their applications, and they're not supposed to put it into their decision-making about whether they take you or not. In Ulster County, up until 2019, when these laws came into effect, they maintained a website of everyone who had ever been in housing court. Not the government, but private people had maintained a blacklist against tenants, saying, so that all the landlords knew whoever was in eviction court. Well, now that's illegal. You're not supposed to ask about it. You're not supposed to consider it in figuring that out. But that's not to say that landlords they can still look at your credit score as a factor in whether they give you an apartment or not. Let's see. So what is the Attorney General's role in the source of income discrimination? Well, we have a special form on our website that specifically addresses, or a place where you can complain if you feel you've been discriminated against. We actually have two forms. One for general housing discrimination if it's based on another category like race or gender or sexual orientation. But we have one specific to source of income discrimination. And we actually have a statewide initiative through all our regional offices who are trying to combat this, because many of the promise of a program like Section 8 is that we're not going to have all of our poverty just stuck in one neighborhood, that people are going to have opportunities to live wherever they want, to have access to better jobs, to better schools, to better transportation. And one way to do that is to use a voucher in private housing in a better opportunity neighborhood. So we want to identify landlords who are doing this. And sometimes that might lead to us filing a lawsuit, but a lot of times it leads to lesser actions that sometimes have the same positive effect. We might write a cease and desist letter. We did this recently. We got a housing authority in Sullivan County wrote to us and said, here's an application. It says, has all these income requirements, and we wrote them a letter. They got rid of all that. They completely changed their application. So it was what they had on there was discouraging anyone who had Section 8 from applying for that housing. So hopefully we can help each other eliminate those barriers in our community, but it really takes people letting us know where this is happening and if it's happened to you. The Attorney General of New York also has special authority under a law called New York Executive Law 6312, and we can ask the court to make someone do something or not do something. We can get money to, when people have experienced a financial impact of discrimination, we might be able to get monetary relief for people. But the landlord has to engage in what we call repeated fraudulent or illegal acts, or otherwise demonstrate persistent fraud or illegality in running their housing. So how do we investigate some of these? And I have to say, the complaint process is a much more user-friendly with the Human Rights Commission. It works. I had a client when I was working at Legal Services who went to go look at a local apartment, and it was one of those situations when she was looking at the apartment, she had Section 8, they wouldn't give her the application to apply for the housing. So she filed a complaint, they investigated it, and in fact, it resulted in her being offered that, maybe not that apartment because a few months had gone by, but another apartment in the same complex. So not everything's about a lawsuit. Sometimes, because lawsuits are hard to get, you need a lawyer. There are lesser opportunities to get that change happening, but we need to hear from you. You need to file a complaint with them or file a complaint with us. So one thing that we do when we get a complaint is we work with these fair housing organizations. They have trained actors they have different qualities. They might be of different races and things like that. It depends on what kind of discrimination we're looking at. But we get someone to call up and pretend to be a Section 8 recipient and see if they say, well, no, we don't take programs. And we record these phone calls. You'd be surprised what people are not afraid to say on the phone. And it becomes very good evidence to play in their face when they have unfortunately discriminated against somebody. But, these people, and so they'll give us the results of all their recordings and when they find evidence of discrimination happening, and then we might do a cease and desist letter. If they don't respond to that, we might have to file a lawsuit against people. I didn't want to make people, we're gonna, if you could wait on your question, try not to forget it. I know it's sometimes hard. I also want to alert people that, a lot of affordable housing that's been made in the last 20 years is actually in part federal and state funding, but you wouldn't know that necessarily. It's something called low-income housing tax credit housing. It's not 100% like public housing or Section 8 where it's completely tied to your income, but sometimes you need a certain middle or low income to qualify for it, but that isn't how they set your rent. But the thing to know about that is that if it's ever come through the state funding source, there are going to be, our state housing agency, Housing and Community Renewal, has a policy about credit. And it says basically, if you're going to be paying your rent through a program with a voucher, they can't turn you away from that type of housing. And that, let's see, even if you don't get the, even if you don't have a rental subsidy, you can have an opportunity to show them that you've been good about paying your rent for the previous 12 months in order to qualify for that housing. And they can't use just your credit score alone or the fact that you filed bankruptcy. They have to kind of look at a whole different thing. So all I want to say is that just be aware that if it's low-income housing tax credit, they can't turn you away just like they would a private landlord maybe would, that there's certain rules that apply to them. And I just want to briefly, since I have your attention, just bring up a few other apartment hunting tips about laws that changed in 2019. So like I already mentioned, they can't blacklist you because you've been involved in housing court before. Another thing you should know is that the maximum fee that they should be charging you for a rental application is only $20. And in order for them to charge you the $20, they have to provide you with a copy of the results of the credit check and proof that they paid $20. If it cost them only $10, they shouldn't be charging you $20. They should be showing the receipt for what it cost them, and if it's less, you shouldn't have to pay $20. You pay what they paid. And then another tip, if you looked at a bunch of different apartments and you paid for a credit report and a credit check at one apartment and they give you the results of it, you should be able to take that to another landlord if it's within the last 30 days and use that and not be charged a new credit check fee. I can tell you this lives on the books in Albany, but then in practicality, I know many times I've just looked through local listings and see people charging more than $20. It's getting better as more people have learned their lesson, but you're all out there. I deputize you too to let us know. And we do have separate complaints for tenant blacklisting and for overcharges for the application fees on our website. So please all help do your part. Let us know who the wrongdoers are in our community. And that's it. That's all.
We also have, there's a new protected class under housing this year, recently, domestic violence victims, yes? Oh, save it, but definitely talk about it.
Thank you. I also have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to start. Okay, so I'm Alexandra Schweitzer. I'm the supervising attorney in the Poughkeepsie Legal Services Office. So today I'm going to be talking about disability discrimination and reasonable accommodations. I'm probably going to refer to them as RAs, it's just easier. So just a little disclaimer. Everything I talk about today is legal information. It shouldn't be interpreted as legal advice, and we're not forming, yes? Sure. It won't form an attorney-client relationship, and if you do need legal advice, you should come to us and open a case and become a client. So who are we? What do we do? So we have 10 law offices, nonprofit law offices throughout the Hudson Valley. Our Poughkeepsie office is just down the street, 1 Civic Center Plaza, Suite 506. Our main passion, really, and my passion, is eviction prevention. We also represent victims of crime in family and immigration proceedings. We do disability advocacy, which is if you're denied for Social Security or if you get any notices of overpayment, we will defend you in those actions. We also do public benefits, so if you need food stamps, rental arrears assistance, or Medicaid issues. And we do have specialty units. We have an HIV unit, an elder unit, and a veterans unit in Poughkeepsie. And at the bottom of the slide is our intake line. That's how you get to us. That's how you open a case and become a client if you're eligible. And I will also have that bigger, bolder on my last page. So can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so disability discrimination. It's prohibited by the Fair Housing Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and also federal, state, and local laws. So what is disability? How is it defined? Federal law defines a person with a disability to include 1, any individual with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits their major life activities, any individual with a record of such impairment, or any individual who is regarded as having such an impairment. So some impairments are readily observable, which could include your being in a wheelchair or having epilepsy, and others may be invisible, such as developmental or mental disabilities. Next slide. Oh, you did it, okay. So the Fair Housing Act, what is it? It protects people from discrimination when they're renting or buying a home, when they're getting a mortgage, when they're seeking housing assistance, or when they're engaging in other housing-related activities. So mainly other housing-related activities. Are you being evicted because of your disability? That's really mainly what I'm talking about. The Fair Housing Act covers most housing, but there are some limits, and I'm not going to go over all of them. It is on the slide, but for example, single-family houses doesn't cover. Next slide, please. Okay, so Section 504. It provides no qualified individual with a disability should be solely based on their disability excluded from the participation in or be denied of benefits if the entity is receiving federal financial assistance. So what is federal financial assistance? Public housing, housing choice vouchers, which is most of the time Section 8, supportive housing for persons with disabilities, physical or mental disabilities, supportive housing for the elderly, and homeless assistance programs. So the ADA, Title II of the ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. It includes housing when the housing is provided or made available by a public entity regardless of whether the entity receives federal financial assistance. So it's a little bit different than the slide that I was talking about before. It's regardless of whether or not there is, for example, HUD funding or whether or not you're getting a Section 8 voucher. So moving on to reasonable accommodations, it's basically I don't want to read it, it's a change or an exception to a rule, a policy, a procedure that gives the tenant the same enjoyment as someone without a disability. So I'm going to give examples further in the presentation, but a support animal, for example, or a ramp for a wheelchair-bound individual, or it could be installing grab bars in a bathroom or a bathroom shower chair, things like that. So it eliminates any barrier that a person with a disability has. The ADA often refers to them as modifications rather than reasonable accommodations. So a modification is a structural change. So kind of like what I was just talking about, it could be adding a ramp, it could be adding a shower grab bar. So who's responsible for the modification? Because that's always what the landlord wants to hear, right? Well, who's going to pay for your ramp? Well, you are most of the time. Unless it's an undue burden, and that usually means money. I mean, you can't have the landlord knock down his house and then rebuild it because you need a wheelchair ramp, right? It's reasonable. What's reasonable? It doesn't mean the landlord doesn't have to do it. It just might mean that the landlord doesn't have to fully pay for it. But it still needs to be done under the ADA. So like I was talking about before, some common examples that we see at Legal Services are permitting a tenant to move to a ground floor. Maybe they broke something, or they became maybe paralyzed and they can't use the stairs any longer and they need to move to a ground floor apartment. That's a very common thing that we see. Accessible handicap parking space. They want their own parking space, or they want a handicap sticker for their parking space if they have a mobility impairment. Another big one we see is adjusting a rent payment schedule. A lot of times people don't get paid until the third of the month or the third week of the month, depending on their Social Security benefits. Some people only get paid bi-weekly if they're working individuals. So we do reasonable accommodations so your rent's not late or considered late, and you don't have to pay the late fee to your landlord. And another big one we see is a lot of buildings are no pet buildings, right? So if you have a service animal or an emotional support animal of some kind, let's say you have seizures and you have a dog that barks when you're having a seizure, but your landlord says, well, we're in a no dog building. All you have to do is, show that the dog is a service or an emotional support animal. So that kind of leads into my next slide. What should a written RA contain? And I always say my best advice is to put everything in writing, record everything. So it should say that you are a qualified individual with a disability. You should list any laws, the ones that I just mentioned. Let's say, and I'm just going to go with the no pet policy example. Because of my disability, I need an emotional support animal. Maybe my son has schizophrenia and the dog calms him. So you don't have to attach medical evidence to the RA. The landlord can come back and ask for it though, but it's not required to be attached as like an exhibit or anything like that. But the landlord is entitled to get that information from you because they want it to be proven. And that is lawful. What isn't lawful is for them to deny the RA under an existing lease because they're discriminating against you because you have that disability. You should also ask for them to contact you back in writing and give them a time limit. I usually give 10 business days, you give them the 2 weeks, because if it's denied, you can take it to court and things of that nature. And then my last slide is just all of the information. Like I said, you can do an intake several ways. You can just walk into our Poughkeepsie office. You can call our Poughkeepsie office. And you can also call the central intake number. So what happens is, I'll just give everyone a little background about how it works. You have to be income eligible. Some of our specialty units have a higher income threshold. If you are eligible, it goes to a supervising attorney like myself, and then we assign out to attorneys. And then the attorneys get your case and they evaluate for advice or direct representation. That depends on, it goes by case, client by client basis. So I have cards for anyone who needs, and out on the table there are general business cards, not mine, but they have our intake number on the back. So, and obviously I'm here to answer any questions, but we have to hold those till the end. Okay, thank you.
the last PowerPoint. But I'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Ben Surface. I'm a supervising attorney at the Hudson Valley Justice Center. We are kind of a sister organization to Legal Services of Hudson Valley. We were founded about 5 years ago by Legal Services of Hudson Valley with the explicit purpose of expanding services to the undocumented community. So Legal Services is not able to represent folks who are undocumented, but our organization is. And so what I'm going to talk about is a sort of small section of the Fair Housing Law that relates to discrimination on the basis of what's called citizenship status or alienage, which are sort of the legal terms that basically mean discriminating against somebody, not just if they're from somewhere else, but if they, on the basis of their immigration status, whether they're documented or not. And so the law on that is fairly straightforward. It's illegal for a landlord to deny a housing opportunity purely on the basis of citizenship status or alienage. And that discrimination can come in the forms of all the types of discrimination we've heard about today, where a landlord may outright say, I don't rent to people who are from there, or you have to have social security number to rent in this building. But it can take a lot of other different forms. If you want to go to the next slide, I have some examples. So it can be, similarly to income discrimination, it can be asking for a higher level of documentation from somebody because maybe the landlord doesn't want to rent to them and suspects that they may be undocumented. And so while they haven't asked other people to provide a passport, all of a sudden the application comes with a passport requirement. It can also take the form of what we see sometimes is making threats to a tenant, basically to report them to immigration if they don't comply with a landlord's requirements now that they are a tenant. And one of the issues that we see a lot when it comes to discrimination from landlords on undocumented folks is less in the form of policies the landlord has and comes more in the form of taking advantage of people who they perceive as being disempowered for a number of reasons. And so if you go to the next slide, I have a little bit of a breakdown of some common issues that we see. So a lot of these issues don't necessarily rise to the level of what might be a cognizable claim in a fair housing proceeding, because the law basically limits what can be a fair housing claim to policies that represent a difference in treatment in terms of who gets the housing or how they're treated once they're a tenant. And some of the realities of the undocumented community is that they are sort of living in a lot of times sort of below the legal system and don't feel that they either have the access to the legal system or they feel at risk from the legal system. And so landlords will take advantage of that, and so we see a lot of situations where tenants are relying on verbal month-to-month leases, so they inherently come with less protection because it's a handshake agreement with somebody, and there isn't the protection of a full lease term. We also, again, we see this issue with threats, right, where maybe a landlord wants to raise the rent or a tenant has been making noise about repair issues, and rather than navigate whatever the tenant's actual concern is or navigate the legal system that the landlords have access to raise rent, they tell a tenant, well, if you don't agree, I'm going to call immigration. Now, a lot of landlords don't even really know what that means. They just say it because it sounds threatening. But the problem is that when you're dealing with a population who feel at risk of that kind of action being taken against them, a lot of what we see is that tenants from the undocumented communities will self-evict. So if a landlord comes to them and says, you've got to go, or I'm raising the rent this much, tenants don't believe that they have access to the kind of resources that maybe people who are documented would have access to, and so instead of fighting it, they just leave. And so that's a common issue we see serving the undocumented community. The other things we deal with a lot is that people who are undocumented are often working. They're working, but they have to work all in cash under the table, right? They're not allowed to work legally, and so they still need to support their families, and they are working, but they get paid in cash, and so they pay their rent in cash, and so they don't get receipts. And so then they're in a situation where either through bad accounting or bad faith, the landlord is taking them to court for rent that they've already paid. And they're in a situation where, they are both involved in a legal system where they often don't speak the language, where they feel disempowered to advocate for themselves, and they have limited access to resources. So, our organization is able to represent them, but they can't go to DSS for rental assistance, right? There are a number of barriers to the kind of services that the undocumented community can take advantage of that New York State doesn't necessarily impose, but that federal funding sources impose. So, while we exist to try and work in tandem with legal services to make sure that citizenship status is not a reason people don't get counsel, it can be a reason that people don't get access to rental assistance. And so, a lot of these issues come out of their special status as someone without, documentation to live in the country. And while the Fair Housing Law has protections for ways in which landlords can and cannot discriminate, we do have a system more generally that puts significant roadblocks in the way of undocumented tenants getting access to resources and being able to stabilize their housing. So that's sort of my piece of this today, and I'm happy to answer questions later on.
I want to thank each of you, all of you, for shining light on different fair housing problems or issues and how your agencies can help. And so it does seem, from what we're hearing, there are options for people here in Dutchess County when they're faced with a fair housing issue. There are resources and places they can go to help. So I just want to remind everybody that there is a one-pager with the contact information for everybody's agency. It's out in the front, so you don't have to remember. It's here. I do want to ask John, before we decide about breaks or questions, if you can just talk about this new passage, a new protected, so when we talk about protected class or protected status, that's also saying your protected identity, right? One or more of your identities that you hold. So domestic violence victim status is now protected in housing, where it was not before. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Thanks, Jody. And I like the way you also, a lot of times when you work in an area for a long time, you tend to kind of default to phrasing and you think everybody knows what you're talking about. So yeah, protected classes means how do you identify, different, in different ways. So with domestic violence victims, Jody is correct, it used to exist in employment. An employer was prohibited from not wanting to deal with a problem, right? Somebody's coming to work, somebody's harassing them, somebody's calling them all the time, somebody's trying to come into the workplace. Well, that person shouldn't suffer the consequences of also losing their job because of that. So they have protections under the New York State Human Rights Law as a victim of domestic violence, and the same application now is true in housing, right? Landlord says, oh, I don't want you living here anymore because you're bringing all of these problems into our apartment building or into our housing development. And all these disruptions and the problems and the police showing up. We just don't want somebody like you living here. And that's protected class. One of the first things I learned from my very first boss was just substitute the protected class and see how it sounds, right? So if you were to say, we really don't want African Americans living here. We don't want Jewish people living here. We don't want, that wouldn't be tolerable. And it's no less tolerable for somebody who's a victim of domestic violence. So those protections also exist now in the New York State Human Rights Law, and we are happy to enforce them.
Great, thank you. So I didn't talk about what the Commission on Human Rights does, and I can make this pretty short. We do a lot of education and consulting, actually, training and consulting. So people call us about housing concerns all the time. Lots of different things, not just about discrimination. And really our process is to help them talk through and get clear and decide what it is they want to do about it, or what kind of help they want, and then where to help get them to help. Sometimes we can intervene, we can certainly call the landlord, or we can call the housing provider, we can help in that way as well. Most people don't always want that because they're concerned about retaliation, and we can't protect them from retaliation. We also are not empowered by the county legislature to investigate, so we don't investigate, and that's why it's really great that we have these partners and resources. If someone wants to have a complaint filed, we give them the number for them to call. We don't share the information. We don't call up, I don't call up John and say, hey, I'm referring a case to you, or anybody here on the panel. We give them the contact information for them to make the call, so that it is confidential. So I just wanted to mention that as well. So I want to check in with everybody. We have snacks downstairs. I want to see if people would like to break for a few minutes for a snack and something to drink, or continue now with questions and snacks after. Questions? Yeah, so let's go to the questions, and then we'll get the snacks. Okay. All right. Let's go to the questions. And also for streaming, because there's streaming.
Okay, no problem. You're welcome. Ooh. Okay, my question is, Mr. Justin, and I can't see your last name, so I can't. Haynes, Mr. Haynes. You mentioned earlier, as it relates to investigating a landlord, there has to be some evidence of fraudulent activities that they had committed previously in order for them to be investigated. My question is, what happens if there was no evidence of additional or previous fraudulent activities? What if your complaint was the only one?
Oh, here we go. Okay. I'm glad you asked that question because I want to clarify. That part about persistent fraud or illegality relates to whether we file a special type of lawsuit. It doesn't mean that we don't investigate individual complaints, especially around source of income discrimination. It could be you're the only one, but if we find evidence that that's happening, we're going to try and deal with that landlord. Like I said, we might send them a letter, say we found evidence that you are discriminating, and so these are the changes we like. And to be honest, a lot of people at that point would enter agreements with us to change their ways in the future. But I don't want people to be discouraged thinking that we have to find tons of fraud or illegality for us to take into action on your individual case. In general, because we're a limited resource and because the law sort of states that, we do look for patterns. Especially my boss puts out the 10 worst landlords list every year in New York City. So we are looking for patterns, and sometimes we might not file a big lawsuit because it's a lot of resources unless there is sort of a larger pattern. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of little efforts that we make below filing a lawsuit to try and get you the relief that you're looking for if you're experiencing some form of discrimination. And it doesn't have to be fraud and illegality. It can be or. So violating another law that exists is a form of illegality in this context. So if you're violating the Fair Housing Act or the New York State Human Rights Law, that could be the illegality part of it. It doesn't mean that you're engaging in criminal behavior. It just means that you're violating some other law that's on the book. And that's true even if it's a county law or a city law. We recently filed, in the last couple of years, we filed a case based on the city of Poughkeepsie's parking ordinance and enforced that law because there was someone locally who was violating that law. So I just thank you for the opportunity to explain that.
Well, thank you. Thanks.
Since the money that comes from the Section 8 program is guaranteed what is the incentive for a landlord not to have it?
Hello? Oh. So one of the big problems that I think landlords find problematic about the program is that they have to do what's right. I mean, and what that I mean is, in order to get approved for a Section 8 voucher to be used on a certain apartment, it has to meet something we call housing quality standards, which means that you can't be running a slum building and get money from these programs. You would have to fix all those things in order to receive this voucher. So I think that's always been the rub, is that, you know, their business model might not involve maintaining an apartment to the best standards, and Section 8 does go in and inspect and make sure that it's going to be safe for someone living there before they can use their voucher. And landlords don't like always fixing those things up.
Thank you. I see several of you nodding your heads. It sounds like that is a problem you've seen.
Like this? How would you assess currently the role of our local governments and also the state and federal, but begin with the local governments? I think of the county government, I think of the towns around the county, the city government, although we have our dear mayor here.
I don't know in what regards you mean to assess the local, county, and state government, federal governments, but you know, I'm a state employee. It's not really my position to kind of assess them, but I think that in general, I think we would say that New York has very strong protections in this regard. I think the federal law only has a handful of those protected groups, like race and sex and religion and citizenship, but as Jody indicated, you know, New York State, and I indicated, 2019 they added source of lawful income. This year they added domestic violence. So, you know, every year it seems that the who's protected gets a little bit bigger, which is a good thing, I think.
Yeah, I think, you know, while there's always, you know, room for improvement, you know, the word is progressive, so it's progressive, not perfection. So we try to make progress together. And I think tonight is evidence of that. We have the county commission, we have the mayor of the city, we have representatives from the state, and we're all trying to figure out ways to get it right to help people who are experiencing fair housing issues here, whether it's locally in Poughkeepsie or Dutchess County or elsewhere in the state of New York.
Now, my question is for the Division of Human Rights. Now, when it comes to a realtor directing people of a race or nationality to certain areas, a lot of times these things are not found out right away. You may find that out like a year or so later, or when they go to put their kids in school and it's not the district they were looking for. Is there a benefit to filing something after the fact?
You know, as close as you can get to the experience, I would always encourage filing because everything is fresh and the evidence is there. But it's a great question. And actually the statute of limitations, so the amount of time you have to file a complaint from when the bad thing happened, was just extended in the state of New York. So previously you were right, I think you said 1 year. You could come to the State Division of Human Rights if the discrimination happened within the past year. You could go into state court and file a claim up to 3 years. So if the 1 year window had closed on you, you could still go into state court and file a complaint. The New York State Legislature just recently changed that statute of limitations, that time period, to make it parallel. So 3 years whether you come to our agency or if you go into state court. That date that's effective is February 16th of this year. So if discrimination occurs on February 16th of 2024 or after, okay, we can look at that all the way up till February 16th of 2027. So there's a 3-year look back. Now there's some practical issues with that too. You know, I would encourage people to file not after they know they've been discriminated against, but after they think, you know, this didn't quite go the way I thought it was going to go. There might be something here that I really would like to have an investigator take a look at. Okay?
And unfortunately, discrimination is alive and well. Just in the last year, I believe they found that there were a lot of realtors in Long Island who were steering people based on race. And, you know, it's so hard for us sometimes because we're in our offices. We don't know always what's happening on the ground. And so I just do want to encourage people to, these laws will mean nothing unless people use them and file those kinds of complaints so that we can know these things are going on.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna, I think often our offices interact with people at a point where they are both experiencing discrimination and facing an immediate housing emergency due to an eviction. And I think I have personally had this experience, I'm sure you have as well, where it feels very unsatisfying to a tenant when they're told, I can help stabilize your housing in this way, we can bring up these issues in court, but this discrimination, the eviction proceeding isn't really the place to bring that up. You need to go file like a human rights complaint. And so when a tenant is hearing, you're being evicted for non-payment, but you know that there's also this other thing going on, and I want to bring it up in housing court, but it's not really relevant to the non-payment issue, go fill out a form, right? That's very disheartening. But I want to echo what's being said here, that it is really the collective effect of tenants being loud to the AG's office and being loud to the Division of Human Rights has the effect of building the strength of that system and creating more accountability. And so while our offices exist, you know, to provide legal representation in housing court when there's an eviction, to provide legal advice on how to take advantage of the rights that the Fair Housing Act does create, I want to really echo that these organizations, the AG's office, DHR, they are powerful, and they are more powerful the more they hear from tenants. And so I really want to encourage people to take advantage of those resources.
I have 2 questions, sorry. The first question is about income requirements. I noticed like in the past few years, there are a lot of like apartment ads that require tenants to make like 3 times the rent to qualify for an apartment. So first question is that, are those legal, those requirements of 3 times the rent, especially in like communities like Poughkeepsie where most people probably don't make 3 times the rent? And then my second question is, through the state, is there a legal mechanism or is the state AG's office have any plans to address redlining in communities like Poughkeepsie, particularly when it affects, particularly when it's happening at the county level? Is there a mechanism for like municipalities to address those type of redlining issues?
So a couple things about the rent multiplier is what I call that, when you have to make X times the rent. In general, for just sort of the general public, it's not an illegal practice. It becomes somewhat illegal when you have someone who has a voucher that's already prepared to pay 100% of your rent, and therefore the income question should be less of a question. So, but I think you'll see in the human rights, the New York State human rights guidance, and I believe in HCR, the Housing Community Renewals guidance, it'll say things like that can potentially be a pretext for discrimination when you have a government program like that. So not a satisfying answer, because housing is a scarce commodity. It's become 100 million times more scarce since the pandemic. It's really changed the vacancy rates here in the city of Poughkeepsie, in the city of Kingston, and all the area. We're seeing these really low vacancy rates because so many people moved here. It's displacing people. at the AG's office, in addition to having our regional offices, we have a civil rights bureau that works on larger kind of civil rights cases. I can't answer, you know, I'm not in that bureau. I don't know if they're addressing, I know they look at the history of redlining very closely, and it does inform some of the work that they do, but I can't speak specifically if they're doing anything in this area on that issue. But you know, if you feel there is something, it may be worthwhile to file a complaint with our Civil Rights Bureau to see if that is something that they're going to look at.
On redlining, or? Yeah, on the redlining issue, that certainly I would want to hear if you have instances of that, or even if it's anecdotal type stuff, because again, we have a unit that's dedicated to that kind of pattern and practice of discrimination, and it may be something ripe for them to want to investigate.
That's really my focus, is that the homeless shelter and the services being placed just locally in the city of Poughkeepsie and around the county. But that's what I mean by like redlining, those type of issues.
If I can piggyback on that, and I have several questions that are interrelated, so if you'll indulge me with this list. There are municipalities in Dutchess County with restrictive covenants. So when the county has been insisting on building the shelter here, in part it's because they don't want to challenge the restrictive covenants in their home municipalities where they have been elected and hold their seats. We have a development in the pipeline here in the city that says that they will be offering certain preferences to City of Poughkeepsie residents, but recently there was a law, I think in New York City, passed that says these kind of preferences to local people cannot be offered. If I can just a couple more. In the city, we have the issue of affordable housing, but or developers who say they are building affordable housing, but city AMI is 1/2 of county AMI. So affordable is always based on county AMI, which makes it unaffordable to many city residents. In terms of discrimination, I'm wondering whether this is an oblique way to discriminate. If you look at many of the developments in the pipeline here, they are for studio and 1 bedroom. Therefore, essentially discriminating against families by virtue of the size of the unit. And then I could go on, but I'll just finish with these 2 things. I think it was Jody who said earlier that zoning and planning should think outside the box. But if you go to a planning board meeting, and this is practically a direct quote, when they justify their approvals, they say, we only go by the law. There's never consideration for what they've just approved down the street or around the corner. They say, this complies with the law, we're approving this. When the total effect of all these approvals undermines the quality of the community. And the last thing maybe you can speak about is this, I don't know whether this law has been passed or is still in the pipeline, that churches, as long as they build affordable units, can build without approval or in contrary to local zoning laws. Thank you.
Thank you. So those are some really great points. I hope you're in the room for a lot of these different meetings and can share your points of view, because I think they're well educated and thought it out. I can speak to that residential preference question. That has been tried in other municipalities around the state and actually caught the Fed's attention. U.S. Attorney's Office has brought some actions around the state of New York because that preference tends to perpetuate race and class. You know, it's a disparate impact, right? So you can say, oh, we just want, we're just giving a preference to people who've lived here all along. Well, if it's only rich people or white people or different people of a certain color who've lived there and they get the preference, you're perpetuating a discrimination which has a disparate impact upon people of other colors. So that is against the law, and that, if that's what's going on, as Justin has said, our agencies want to know about it. We have a partnership with the U.S. Attorney's Office to investigate and prosecute cases of fair housing discrimination. I think a lot of the other things you said were more in statement form, and I would agree with them. And I don't know that I have real answers or anything I'd want to add unless some of my colleagues would like to.
No, I was going to comment on the same thing. That was the easiest part of all the very difficult questions or statements you made, because there have been communities in Westchester that tried to keep their Section 8 programs only for people based on giving them a preference for people who live locally, but it was a white community which had an ability to kind of keep other people out. So that's been found to be unlawful. But I'm getting a huge vibe here that this is a very pressing issue for a lot of people, and so maybe a larger conversation needs to happen with our agencies about what's happening locally.
Yeah, and I would just, to sort of go on the question about, what qualifies as affordable housing and where emergency shelters are being placed, and how those current decisions are now fitting into a legacy here in Poughkeepsie of things like urban renewal and redlining and discriminatory sort of practices at a zoning level that are now being exacerbated in a desire to fix some really big issues, right, of people experiencing homelessness and a lack of affordable housing. One of the things I will plug, right, is that the need for homeless shelters goes down if we're keeping people in their homes, right? And affordable housing is more effective when it's made more stable. And so right now, City of Poughkeepsie did an amazing thing where they passed good cause eviction protection, and then basically the landlords were able to sue and say that you can't do that until the state acts. And so the state is right now on the cusp of passing a somewhat watered down but still meaningful good cause eviction law, which municipalities will have to opt into. And so I'm just going to take this opportunity to plug all of y'all who are here, who are clearly engaged, the mayor, that assuming that law gets passed in the current form that it's been proposed, that Poughkeepsie should be first in line to adopt it, because the effect will be that large landlords who purport to want to have affordable housing in this area will be required to offer renewal leases to tenants who are abiding by the lease and paying their rent on time. That the amount the rent can be increased will be benchmarked to inflation, right? And so that it will create a system in which there is more stability for tenants, and so the affordable housing that does get built will be more stable for the people who live in it, and the need to increase the amount of time and money and land we devote to treating the symptom of the housing crisis, which is by building shelters where we can find a place to put them because we need a roof over people's heads, that those resources can be more adequately spent elsewhere, and these kind of questions will be less pervasive. So it's not, it doesn't address the immediate zoning issue that you're raising, but I do think, when we treat these systems as sort of interconnected, and shelters are downstream from evictions for us, right? And so if we can do things to minimize the amount of time people spend in eviction court and spend seeking emergency shelter, then we minimize the need for them.
And I just add that it was covered in the Times Union, I think, in the last week, but my office does get involved in zoning issues. There were instances of zoning that was discriminating against based on religion, and we have been involved in that in several communities that were passing restrictive laws. So this might be something to file a complaint about so that we can look into it further. I can't make any promises, but.
Well, it's part statement, part question. While everybody on the legal end, it's all well and good, but unless we get to the point where we have builders, because I've experienced where builders come in and they will build to a certain level of affordability, but it's affordable for somebody who makes more money than we do. Until municipalities are able to do, and I hate to use it because it sounds very overhanded, a iron fist inside of a velvet glove. Say, if you're going to come in, you're going to renovate in Poughkeepsie, there are a certain percentage that you need to devote to low and middle income housing, and that should be anyone, whether it be out and out building it or renovating, because there's been attempts after attempts to build on the 400 section of Poughkeepsie, which is closer to the train station, and working your way up. And the biggest thing why people won't touch it, I want to make a profit. Before we can get to the legal aspect, and unfortunately, without that, it's going to occur because landlords still have the ability to not extend leases. Strictly, if you want to go strict, they don't have to extend your lease. I've had issues where I've made complaints to the landlord of ADA issues, and I've not pressed it because there's no place for me to go. If I have no place to stay. So it's really more of a statement that before we can look at the legal aspect of the issue, we have to really look at the product. We have to get, when builders come in and say, this is what Poughkeepsie requires. If you're going to renovate, you have to devote a certain percentage to low and middle income housing, and put it in with that little iron fist. If you refuse, being barred for any other building properties in, we'll talk locality Poughkeepsie, you want to continue Dutchess County. Now, as for shelters, I'm also really not big with where they placed the Poughkeepsie shelter, because it's in the former Dutchess County Jail. Now, that's bad optics, bad, pure and simple. You're saying homeless people are criminals, but it's because there originally was a deal to have the shelter put on the Oakley Street area, which a building formerly across from old Navy recruitment, and that was poo-pooed because of people in the section say, oh, this is going to bring down our property values, it's going to change the view of our section. Sometimes you got to look past that. Sometimes you got to say, for the betterment of all, that section has to suck it up. And and I love all the legal people. I'm a big Shakespeare guy, so you know where I'm going to go with that one. Until you do increase the I'll say the quality of the housing, or housing period, you're going to have legal problems. And I wish there weren't, and people have to be able to have something to back them up.
So again, not having a place to go, even if you're going to if you have, you want to file a complaint, that threat hanging over you, it reduces your willingness to do it sometimes, yeah. Okay, let me just see, is there anyone else who hasn't? Yes.
Oh,
One is one of a statement, just to let you know, what we're working on in the city of Poughkeepsie. We are looking into ways of incentivizing developers to be able to build workforce housing. So if you know, there was a moratorium that was with the IDA, so they're not giving any pilots at this point right now until we can revamp of how we're going to look at incentives going forward. Because it seems like we don't have very much control. The city did a good clause eviction, and then all of a sudden they found loopholes too, where now people are still being kicked out of their apartments because they can raise the rent if someone purchased the property. We find people flipping properties just to get around that. So I think it's discriminatory, and I also think it's criminal that you can turn around and you can raise somebody's rent by $800–900 a month, knowing that they can't afford it and knowing that what their income level is. So I mean, I think that should be looked at as a whole, that a person should not be able to do that, because now you're setting people up to fail and setting them up to be homeless. So I'm hoping that the state will look more into that and working with the agencies, because sometimes I feel like our hands are tied. And so that was one of the things that to bring up, and also about the homeless shelter. Basically, it's not just about people who are complaining because they just don't want it in their neighborhood because it's going to bring their property value down. It's everything else, the challenges that come with it. And that particular area is already dealing with, drug activity and dealing with all the other, problems that come with low-income poverty neighborhoods, and right now they're going through a nightmare with the homeless shelter right on Hamilton Street. So we're trying to move that into an environment where not only were people who live there at the homeless shelter or trying to turn their lives around will be in a more better environment where they can focus on healing, versus being in an environment where you got predators are hanging around trying to come after them as soon as they come out the shelter to sell them the drugs or what. And our police are overworked as it is trying to deal with that. So it's where you place the shelters where it really matters. And right now it's, well, if everybody else don't want it, let's throw it right there, in the most challenging ward in the city of Poughkeepsie, because that's what people look at. As long as it's not in my neighborhood, then we can put it there. So at this point right now, it's something that we need to look at, what is fair, and all these things have been happening, especially in that neighborhood. When you talk about urban renewal, we had the arterials go right through the neighborhoods where houses were taken. There's a lot of different practices that were made just now that people are struggling now because of practices and what was put in place by higher state and by the county government. So now it's time for us to start looking at is how that's going to start working for us. And so that we need to kind of step up when we see these practices, fight against that, and that's what we want to do. So we want to look at this, the city as a whole. So just look at it as whatever happens on that side of the city will affect you too, no matter where you live. So we just want to make sure everybody understands that, because it's very quick to say, well, it's not in my neighborhood, so I don't care. So we just hope that everybody comes together to realize it affects us all. We're a very small city, and it seems like a lot is being placed in our neighborhoods that we seem to be fighting, but people are taking a blind eye to.
Thank you. Just want to check in. Anybody just a question?
I have a comment about, and really a question about the law that was repealed in New York City that was mentioned, and John, you elaborated on it, where the feds got involved and saw that certain areas were using that practice to discriminate for people outside the areas. Now, how does this affect those areas that would like to allow upward mobility? For example, the set-asides for the poor people or lower income people, when a developer's coming in and building upscale housing in communities such as by the train station and so forth. How does that affect the set-asides to match the people whose income are of that community? Because it sounds like that law or that legislation knocks out the ability of a locality to have set-asides for the community in order to allow lower income people to move up into higher scale developments. So how does that affect that? And if it does, then you and Justin seem to have the ability to speak to this, to such that this particular practice, I know that it has been used to discriminate, but it's also been a way for communities to allow upward mobility when people of the area are being priced out.
Yeah, we go. I think it's a great point, you know, and I think that's the reason why we have events like tonight, to hear all the different types of viewpoints on things. I told you, I think, the bad impact, right, of preferences, but I can see what you're saying about if there is a way for people, upward mobility, right, that would be, but if they're already residents in that community, then that preferential treatment wouldn't impact them in a negative way, right? Because preference, if you are a resident of the community, let's say the preference law is in effect, right? And you are living there and you have a certain socioeconomic class, and as you progress and you want to buy a bigger home, let's say, that preference wouldn't impact you in a bad way, right? It would, hey, I have a preference to buy this home because I've lived here all my life. The problem is it becomes exclusionary after a period of time, because if there has been an economic impact, which inarguably there is, that discrimination has caused, it's an impact on lower income earning people. That impact eliminates and diminishes housing opportunities for them. So perpetuating that impact by saying only people who are residents of a certain neighborhood can continue to be, are going to get that preference, it kind of perpetuates the discrimination. So, and I'm happy to talk offline on this a little bit more, because I think that probably would be helpful too, because I think I want to better understand a little bit where you're coming from too. But my thought is that if you live in the community and you want to be upwardly mobile, regardless of your socioeconomic or your racial status, that preference wouldn't negatively impact you. But I'm worried about how it would negatively impact other people, based upon what I've shared.
Okay, so we'll take one more question. It seems like, Fred, you had one more thing you wanted to say.
I happen to live in the town of Poughkeepsie, and I continue to feel very guilty about the fact that when we first moved into this area, we went to the bank in the city and tried to rent a home here, and the redlining took place. And ever since then, I've been an advocate of trying to get, at the very least, some collaboration between the city of Poughkeepsie, with all its problems, not just housing, and the surrounding towns. Most dramatically, the town of Poughkeepsie and Spockenkill, and I won't lecture any further, but I wondered if you could speak to that issue, the building collaboration between cities and towns, the cities plagued with poorness, and the neighboring towns that continue to flourish, economically. I urge you all to drive out Route 44 and see the dramatic continuation of this process.
I'll just say, as someone who didn't grow up in this area but moved here in 2017, I never understood why there was a city of Poughkeepsie and a town of Poughkeepsie, a city of Kingston and a town of Kingston. Well, I think that probably has some historical things that you're talking about who was living in the city and who was not wanting to pay for the city and who wanted to live outside the city. But you're right, I think we have to think about ways to bridge those resources now, between the haves and have-nots, and yeah, I can't say much more than that. I mean, but I think you're right. We're not policymakers here. We take the laws that the policymakers create and we try to use them to the best effect of helping people. But yeah, everyone should be really engaged in your political system to elect people who have those kinds of ideas, if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that. I mean, I think, and I don't want to sound sort of beat a dead horse here, but if the city of Poughkeepsie passes good cause eviction protection and the town of Poughkeepsie also passes good cause eviction protection, then what you have is a system where landlords and developers can no longer say, I don't want to build in city of Poughkeepsie, I'm going to build in the town where I don't have to worry about good cause eviction protection, right? And so I think what has happened across the state with things like rent stabilization and a number of different tenant protections is that it's a patchwork, right? And so when a developer is looking where they're going to invest their money, they're looking for the voids in that patchwork, right? Where those tenant protections don't exist. And so what I would say is if you're looking at disparate impacts that happen across these town and city lines where, you know, the city of Poughkeepsie with its mayor and its city council are taking steps to protect the tenants there, but the town of Poughkeepsie isn't, then a developer is going to look at the town of Poughkeepsie as a place where they can make more money, right? And so what I would encourage, you know, if you live in the town, seems like you're active, other people who may be living in the town, if the city of Poughkeepsie is passing good cause, the town's right behind them. And so that you're creating an area where if developers want to make money and they want to do it in Dutchess County, they're going to comply with all the same rules wherever they go. And that those rules set a baseline for what tenants can expect in terms of their protection, right? Fair housing law is powerful because towns don't get to opt in or out. It applies everywhere. And so we want the same system for tenant protections when it comes to good cause.
Thank you. We do have one more question, so we want to give everybody the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's going to be a really quick question. And this was something that was brought up previously, which had to do with the exemption to religious communities to build. So I live in the town of Poughkeepsie. We tend to have single-family zoning. There is really a need to increase housing stock, and for that, we need to start thinking about multifamily zoning. And so in residential communities where I live, it seems to me that the only people who have exemption are religious communities. Could you speak to that? And then could you also speak to whether, if religious communities do have exemption to build, are they legally expected to provide fair housing to all? Or do they come under sort of the category of providing only to those who follow that faith?
I have to admit, this tonight, to be honest, is the first time I'm hearing that there's certain religious building exemptions. I have to plead my ignorance about this particular issue, so I can't speak to it. But I think it's an interesting issue. I think maybe it whenever we get near religion, there's always the First Amendment considerations, especially when you're talking about either a locality's government or the county government or the state government or the federal government, because the First Amendment protects against that government intrusion on religious freedom. So I don't know specifically what you're talking about, but I think it's probably a complicated issue, and I'm not well-versed enough to speak about it.
Yeah, so traditionally speaking, religious institutions have had exemptions from different types of it. There's an exception in the law for religious institutions. Different civil rights laws, including the state human rights law when it comes to places of public accommodation, different than housing, has an explicit exemption for religious institutions. So I think it has to be looked at. If there is a pattern or practice that's developing around this type of development, I think it'd be worthwhile to look at that exemption, from a legislative or a regulatory standpoint, because as I mentioned, there is a First Amendment in our Constitution that kind of frames this in a way that could make it challenging, but that doesn't mean it can't be worked on.
Okay, so I want to thank our panel for all of their great insight and wisdom and giving us all this great information, and also all of you for coming tonight and your questions and your comments. So thank you very much. I've mentioned the refreshments. We do have some things downstairs, so if you'd like to join and take something with you, please feel free to do that or stay and chat for a few minutes. I also want to thank Beulah Baptist Church for hosting us tonight. Again, thank you. And our mayor.